All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Improve Your Performance Today by Connecting KPIs to Data-Driven Metrics. This webinar is brought to you by Applied Software. My name is Misty Scott, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. We'll begin with a quick intro video on how to get the most out of this webinar and interact with us today. Okay, here we go.
Hi, and welcome to this Applied Software webinar. We're glad you could join us today. Get more out of the webinar by clicking on the icons at the bottom of your screen. You can resize these. This button leads to resources. This button adjusts the volume. Just don't push this one. I'm watching you. Be sure to find Applied Software on social media and on our website, asti.com, where we'll empower you to discover what's possible. You can also find a complete schedule of upcoming events, on-demand webinars, and training on our calendar at asti.com/calendar. This is being recorded for your convenience. You'll be receiving an email with the recording link for future reference. And make sure to stick around. We'll answer questions at the end. See you there.
Awesome. All right, guys. Yeah, as the video mentioned, you can find a schedule of upcoming events, webinars, and training on our calendar at asti.com/calendar. So make sure you check that out. All right, guys, I am super excited to introduce our speaker today. Lance Kirby is a director of AETG services at Applied Software. Lance influences every level of the organization seeking to improve their efficiency, quality, and effectiveness in deploying leading BIM practices. A super awesome fact about Lance is he literally helped to write the book on Autodesk Revit, which is the premier BIM tool. So Lance, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we do have a poll question before we get started with the content, but do you want to go ahead and introduce our topic today, and then I'll roll right into the poll question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Misty. Appreciate it. And just for point of fact, I help edit books. I don't write as much as I used to, but though it's good, that's great. No, so this topic's really interesting, and I'm going to frame it in a couple of ways before I get into why I think you're here to learn about some KPI alignment. First thing I want to think about is the fact that we had a previous presentation maybe about a month ago where we talked about metrics and optimizing workflow. And I think that's going to tie into this a bit, but this is kind of circling back to the larger picture. And that is, what is your organization doing for metrics? And how does that tie into what you're doing at the operational level? And that's the case I'm going to be making today. If you find yourself apart from the KPIs of your organization, then I think to me it might be an opportunity for you to get more information by managing up some of the expectations of what, say, your finance director or CFO is doing, aligning with your leadership and operational folks. And to me, that's a big opportunity for a lot of organizations, is being able to kind of break out of the typical silo you're in and understand the bigger picture. And so that's one of the things that I'm really excited about. And so today I want to try to make that connection stronger. So to me, there are some different positions that you might be in terms of your KPI. So for instance, you might be thinking about even at the operational level that you have some inefficiency or ineffectiveness. Typically, I find in the industry, people are pretty effective at what they do. They could be more effective with additional workflows or opportunities, but efficiency is definitely a big thing. And so if I had to guess that you have some efficiency challenges, that's probably something I'd put money on, right? So in this case, if you have some of those challenges and you don't know quite how to get connected with the KPIs, that's something we'll talk about today. I also think too, maybe you're connected with KPIs through your management or leadership, but you're not quite sure how to connect them directly to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so we'll spend some time talking about, identifying what KPIs that you're going after and how to align that with the kind of the organizational metrics as we'll talk about, or operational metrics. All right. And then for some of you, you might know what the KPIs are and you know how to gather them, but then you're trying to figure out how to analyze and commit that to action. And I think that's the other part of it. So even very sophisticated organizations still have some gaps in workflow performance because they understand they have challenges. They may not know how to influence those things and how to continue to kind of match the trajectory. So those are the kind of things I think that you're here for, that we're going to talk about today.
I love that. I think that's super relevant to a lot of different roles here. And we'll go ahead and jump into this poll question and get things rolling. Okay, so poll question is, what is the primary performance measurement in your organization? Is it utilization, project multipliers, work in progress, earned value, backlog/runway, or is it something else? So I will read it one more time for you guys. All right. What is the primary performance measurement in your organization? Is that utilization? Is it project multipliers? Maybe it's work in progress, earned value, backlog/runway, or other. So Lance, what do you think? What do you think is going to come through here?
I'm going to guess utilization is a pretty common one. That's one that kind of hits the entire organization. So everybody knows they've got to be, at a certain level of utilization. So that's a pretty common metric and an easy one to grasp. If you're running, obviously if you're in business development, you're thinking about, the backlog, the work that we have to do on the books that we have it committed to. So how much when we say runway, how much work do we have in the next X number of months, right? Mm-hmm. And then you also think about, to me, when you're a manager, you're thinking about kind of, not only project multipliers per phase, but you're also thinking about, the earned value. How much of this project have we earned to date? And is it, connected? Is it close to the planned? Is it better or worse than the planned value that we'd hoped to achieve at this point in time?
Awesome.
All right.
Yeah. You know what? This is a very interesting poll question. I'm excited to see how they come in. Let's see. Oh, look at there. So we've got utilization and work in progress. So that's pretty cool. Pretty interesting there. All right.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you bring some content and some good takeaways for us today. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Misty. So I'm going to cover a few things today, and I want to kind of keep this still high level. I think there are lots of opportunities for us to talk about some specifics and grabbing metrics, and I'll try to leave some time at the end to talk about that because there's so many different opportunities. I think a case study is probably not the best way to approach it, but I think if we kind of cover the big picture, that we can then start to get down into the weeds a little bit. So I want to talk about the KPIs in general, kind of go on a little bit more about what we just had in the poll question. I want to start connecting that to operational metrics as well, because I think that's really important. And that we'll get into kind of lead versus lag indicators, because I think that's an important aspect to all this stuff. I want to talk a little bit in general about the measurement process, because I think that's where the kind of the technical challenge of all this is. How do I get consistent and predictable metrics, right? And predictable in the sense that it falls within a range, right? That we can say, yeah, I can validate this based on that range. And then I think, to me, it's also a call to action on analysis and results, because often we get a lot of information, a lot of data from our processes that we do every day. We may have some interpretation on that, but we don't necessarily then take that next step into formulating a measure or a countermeasure to improve the performance of that process based on its measurement and trying to get some results out of that. And I've talked about that in some other webinars that I've done recently, just trying to get buy-in and get people to understand the opportunities that you might learn from, kind of the pattern recognition of metrics, right? So it's a very powerful thing, but sometimes it gets so complicated that, we can't see the forest for the trees, right? All right. So let's talk about what's the challenge here. And to me, it's the fact and the premise that I'm setting up for you today is that the organization you're in has KPIs, right? There are things that you're tracking at an organizational level in terms of trying to meet your strategic goals that might be, per quarter, per year, per 5-year cycle. But someone's tracking that. And typically it falls into kind of the finance side. It might be more on the client and the work that you're gathering, how you're performing on that work. But a lot of that stuff, too, is also connected to the day-to-day operations, right? I mean, obviously, you've got things on the client side, but you also have things on the internal operational side. And those are the things that we're going to try to influence today. So how do you actually get some good metrics and be able to act on those metrics, right? So to me, here's the opportunity. I want us to be able to think about aligning our kind of lead operational metrics with our business lag KPIs. And the way I frame it with lead and lag, lagging indicators are kind of the output of all our processes, the trends and changes as I've described here. Lead indicators are inputs, things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. To some degree, I mean, they're opposites, right? They're influencing each other. Like, so for instance, you think about a magnet, right? It has it's got its poles, right? And those poles are pushing against each other, but at the same time, they're still connected, right? It's a challenging construct that we've built. Often your leadership is thinking about the KPIs as lag indicators, but from day to day, you're working on lead indicators to make changes, right? So to me, the best analogy that I've ever come up with it kind of relates to trying to lose weight, right? This is something that, I'll admit I struggle with myself. When you decide, hey, I need to lose 20 pounds, right? And immediately you're thinking about the lag indicator. The lag indicator is weight, right? So if I, after some period of time lose 20 pounds, I've met my goal. And so the lag indicator is, negative 20, right? The thing is, you don't just step on the scale every day and hope to be negative 20, right? Or even showing progress toward negative 20. Oh, I'm negative 2 today. I'm making progress. The thing is, you have to be doing things actively as, kind of lead measures in order to get to that lag indication of 20 pounds lost, right? So what are those things? Did I exercise today? How many miles did I walk? How many steps did I walk? How many calories did I intake today? So those kinds of things are lead indicators, right? So if I meet a set of lead indicators, then I'm making it more likely that I'm going to get to the lag indicator, or the lag indicator is going to recognize that I've made progress toward this goal, right? So that's how those I think about those generally being equated. All right. So what's this premise that I'm talking about? This idea of let's align the business KPIs with our operational metrics in order to drive performance change. Okay. So if we accept that premise, what are some of the steps involved with that? And it's at high level steps. All right. So the first thing is you have to kind of define, and I want to say wildly important KPIs at the organizational level that then you can measure with everyday work. Okay. And I'm going to get into that a little bit of detail. But think about it. You can't just take every single KPI that the business has and try to align it with something you're doing at the operational level every day. They're definitely influencing it, but trying to measure that change is very difficult. I mean, one example that we saw with one of the KPIs might be, what's our accounts receivable on a particular project? Okay, well, that's something that is really kind of outside, it's partly influenced by your organization, but, also it's up to your client. And so that's not something I can do things every day to measure, how that's changing. So that's a challenging one. So you need to find things that you can affect. Just like we pointed out in the poll, utilization is a big one, right? So I can give you some examples on that one. Next thing you want to do is you want to determine how how we measure it now, or how we could measure based on people, process, and technology. Okay, what I mean by that is this idea that you're measuring stuff now, right? Like when you do a timesheet, that's a measurement. That's a measurement of billable or non-billable time toward project or toward overhead, right? That's a people one. Processes could be thinking about, how I can measure the planned amount of hours toward a task versus the actual, right? And then also technologies. Technologies are recording things too, and we've got some great technology now that allow us access to additional capabilities. Like I think about things like Tableau or Power BI. That's been around for a few years now in the industry. And I think we're seeing more and more people take advantage of what they're learning from those things. So we want to talk about that a little bit. So third step is I want to create a simple process for extracting this information and being able to put it into meaningful and actionable intelligence. And that is, so that's implying that we're doing some kind of analysis of it, right? So if I get this data, and this data may be already there, maybe something that you have to build a process to get. Okay, great. What do you do with it, right? You got to be able to think, okay, how can I, one, see the baseline for this, and then be able to see change by doing different things, right? And so there's going to be outside pressure. There's going to be internal changes that make that fluctuate. And so being able to analyze and understand what the effects are on one, not only the metric, the operational metric, but then how it ties back to that KPI is going to be important, right? And finally, that fourth piece is we want to route these metrics through a framework for change. And what I mean by that is understand that you're gathering metrics not for just informational purposes, that we want to do something with it, right? That we actually want to then use it as leverage to make changes in the organization. And those changes could be minor, they could be major, depending on the level of metric that you're pulling. But the important thing is, up front, even before you're starting to build the system, you're getting people to buy into the fact that we're going through this process and that we're gonna make changes on that. And frankly, that is one of the hardest things of all this stuff, right? If I determined that I was going to figure out something with utilization, I was able to tie it to several operational metrics, and then I found a pattern that we can affect and improve performance, and I was able to determine in a plan what that change was going to be. I got to get buy-in. I got to get people convinced that this is the right thing to do, even if it's temporary, a pilot, as it were, to make this change. I have to get people thinking about this is the whole point of us doing something different, right? And so that, to me, is the kind of the hinge on all this stuff, right? All right. So we mentioned that poll question, some very common KPIs. In my research, I found that things like utilization. I've been dealing with utilization rate for a long time. Earned value, as we said, other mentioned in the poll question. Work in progress. That's a good one as well. profitability, some of these things that could be related on the financial side, maybe less about, more about business development and scoping projects and maybe less about operational efficiency. But I still think, there is some ability to change those financial things because they're a lag indicator for a lot of these lead indicating operational metrics. Okay. Some other ones you said you might think about, the aged accounts, proposals pending. Some people track how many proposals they have out or how many they're able to produce, your market share in any given, building type or other process. And even the kind of, the idea of, how often do we close a deal? Right. So some of these things are less in control or less influenced by what your typical software users doing on a day-to-day basis and producing work, but still could be influenced by some of the other decisions in the organization. All right. So let's think about how can we start to measure or take a current measurement or find additional measurement in the people and the process, the technology that we have every day, in terms of understanding what the KPIs are, right? So if we've determined that we've got 2 or 3 KPIs that we want to try to influence at the organizational level with an operational metric, we have to be able to connect the potential of how they are how they were influenced, right? And so if the KPIs are typically at the kind of the financial level, and then they said they could be lag or lead as well. We get that information from things like project billing and invoicing. We could be getting that from timesheets. What checks did we get this month? Accounts receivable, things like that. And, you think about things like, QuickBooks or Deltek, Vantage Point or BQE Core, that these overall management systems that are dealing with invoices and accounts receivable, and they're tying into project management, how much work can we bill for, invoicing, all that kind of stuff. The operational metrics has some overlap with that. But I find that even though we're tracking some of that stuff, it may be less involved with kind of metric tracking in terms of understanding what these things mean, right? So you can think about a financial person's thinking about forecasting. They're thinking about, okay, we've got this much work ahead of us. Do we have enough manpower? Do we need to go and hire more people? Those kinds of things. But an operational side, you may or may not be tracking that, people take 10 hours to do an 8-hour process. Okay. So I think those things are more challenging. And I think that's where some of this work comes up, right? Thing is, we have some of this data. You have to, one, think about it being important to you, and then go ahead and find it, and then have it in a format that you can digest, analyze, and be, and have actionable, right? So I think some of those examples might be typical project work, timekeeping, things of the operational nature. I mean, you could even throw in some, QA, QC processes, or if you're doing construction administration, those things, have some other subtle things besides just timekeeping for processes. I mean, I think about construction administration. In fact, we've got a webinar coming up on that in a couple of weeks, and the technology around that. And having done construction administration years ago myself, I know that it's not only a process you have to go through, and it takes time, and you've scoped out time to do this stuff, but it also has a financial impact, right? So if we've had some kind of omission, or we've had a change based on other part of the design process, that might have a financial impact based on CA. But that's something, if it's numbers, we can track it as a metric and be able to understand how it influences not only project profitability, but also the company profitability, right? And so that's the thing I think is really interesting here, is that there's a lot of data out there that we can access. It's just a matter of finding the reason to go and get this data, finding an easy way to get it, a way to understand it, and then again make it actionable. All right. Now, one thing I've got here too, don't forget baseline. I think that's important for people to recognize. Any kind of measurement process, you have to have as much as you can a non-biased baseline, right? If I were to come in and help you try to optimize a process, I'm going to try to establish a baseline right away. And there's a baseline that talks about what we think we should be doing right now, and then what we're actually doing. And then once you establish those things, then you can think about, okay, where we like to go, right? What's the trajectory to get to? And so that's a way to think about it. One thing you might notice, the kind of overlap in technology, I think ends up being kind of the timekeeping. And that goes back to utilization being a pretty standard thing to think about. So we're going to keep going with that theme and talk more about that. All right. And lo and behold, here we are. So once you determine some of those things that you're going to be able to track at the operational level, then I think you think about creating a process. And I say simple because if it's complicated, you're not likely to do it, right? And that's the biggest challenge, I think, with all this stuff. There's a lot of technology, and we've got more and more data. It's almost exponential in its growth coming to you, right? The thing is, the more data you have to sift through, the less likely you're going to find patterns. And so that's where we say, okay, well, can I get some kind of AI or machine learning tool to help me figure this stuff out? Yeah, and the answer is yeah. I mean, they're out there, and you can start to access some of those things. I just love the premise of a metric-driven kind of dashboard, and being able to throw a bunch of data at it, and then it help you understand some patterns, right? Having worked a little bit with Power BI in the past few years, there's a ton of potential in that, right? One example I'll give you on just kind of utilization that I worked with a customer years ago was this idea that they saw a discrepancy in billable work or billable time on a project and what they thought the project was going to have, right? And I apologize, I got to turn my robot off. There we go. Luckily, I have my robot remote control there. Sorry about that. And so in this case, this example was, they were expecting a certain amount of work on a project and weren't seeing it compared to the time card. So this work was being done in Revit. And so they were able to pull information from journal files. And if you're not familiar with journal files, it's something we've had for a long time for Revit. And it could do things like batch processing. It could find errors and things of that nature. But it also just gives you timestamps for when people start and stop a process. So in this case, they took two bits of data. They took what their timekeeping said, and it may have been Deltek or something similar where they kept their timesheets, and it says, okay, this person said that they were spending 32 hours a week on this project. And then they went and pulled up journal files and from that same period for that person, and they actually ran an analysis, and I believe they used Tableau in this case, and it pointed out the fact that they weren't actually doing 32 hours worth of work. In fact, they were doing, more like 8 hours worth of work, and then they were doing the rest of their work on a different project that had not the same amount of work being applied to it. And so they found this pattern by looking at timesheets and Revit journals, and they were able to find a discrepancy. And when they did more investigation, it turned out, hey, this person was not billing the project that they were actually doing work on, right? And that, the politics of project management, right? So the reason I give you this example is there's a lot of data out there that you can get at. The thing is, in this case, they knew they had a problem that was influencing the, not only the utilization, but project profitability, right? And so they were able to develop quickly a procedure for going and doing this. And it may have been a one-off kind of investigation, but there's no reason that couldn't be automated and pushed into a dashboard, right? And not that you want to be scrutinizing everybody to the nth degree in your team, but just this idea that you can be pulling patterns and be able to make adjustments on that is, it's the future, right? Being able to, because you have the data, you have the ability to analyze the data very quickly, and then your challenge is, how's that actionable, right? So in this example I'm giving you here for utilization, obviously, it's the billable hours versus the available hours. Now, the challenge in this is that there's explicit and implicit meaning to this, right? So if I reduce overhead, right, the time to do things that are non-billable, then potentially I could have more billable hours and get things done. But there's also this implicit idea too, this idea that what if I improve the productivity of the billable hours and it actually goes down? What does that mean? Well, someone might see that and argue, says, hey, why aren't we as billable as we used to be? Well, the thing is, I might be producing the same amount of work in less time. And now I'm spending a little bit more time doing overhead to, build a more efficiency, right? So I could be actually improving the efficiency and effectiveness of our company, but it appears that I'm doing the opposite, right? And that's the challenge with analyzing these things, right? And so in this case, if the lead indicator is the kind of the billable hours, and the lag indicator is the output of work, you have to be able to interpret what do changes to this process mean. So I kind of framed utilization in a couple of ways. So productivity and billable hours, right? You think, okay, if I, if we understand a task pretty well, and I know it takes a certain amount of time to do that task, and if I make that more efficient, right, then I said I'm getting more productivity in the billable hours, and that can't be bad, right? We just have to understand that might, change the utilization rate. But there's also this idea of being able to eliminate work and rework with the technology, right? So the thing is, if I'm doing my work faster, it doesn't mean that necessarily, as I just said, going and doing more overhead. Maybe I'm working on the next project and I'm able to get more billable earned work on the projects done in any given time period because they were much more efficient, right? Or even a little bit more efficient. And so that's some of the things that we would look at. Well, how do I get more efficient, and how do I measure that with an operational metric, right? There's also this idea of being able to reduce overhead too, right? So if I am more efficient with my billable time and I have less overhead to do to make me efficient, then potentially, through automation or whatever it is with the technology, that's going to make us more efficient, having less overhead. Now, the thing that I think the challenge with overhead is I've visited a lot of design firms over the last couple of decades, and people often like, okay, yeah, our utilization's 95%. It's 100%. And I think 100%, how do you get to 100% utilization? There's no overhead. Oh, well, people work overtime. Okay, so that's a big challenge, right? The thing is, I think some overhead is important, right? What is overhead like? Training. Training is something we need to continually do, right? There's new technology, there's new processes, there's new skills in the industry that we need to keep up with. So building in some overtimes, I think, is important. The thing is, should your focus be less on the utilization and more on trying to improve the billable time that you do have by being more productive, more efficient, more effective in that time period? Okay. So to me, there's a lot of nuances to this, and it's not just trying to make you better utilized. it's, trying to make you more efficient for the time that you are billing or the time that you're doing overhead, and then said overhead is sometimes something you need, right? Okay. Another one I was thinking about too was this idea of, earned value, right? So if I've got a contract amount, what have I earned of that contract amount at any given period, right? And I think this is an easy kind of manager level KPI to track, right? So leadership's looking at this from the top down. It's definitely influenced by the everyday user and the work that they're doing. So I think, to me, this is another easy one to connect to, right? And the thing is, it all goes back to this idea that I have a planned cost and I have an actual cost, right? And if I'm looking at the work that we've done so far, and being able to bill that, I know that, one, we're staying on track or that we're being profitable, but also, two, when it's not happening, that's a challenge, right? The thing is, if you're doing a BIM or a VDC process, then that may be skewing things, right? And that's something we've been talking about for a long time, this idea that if I'm pushing a lot of the decision-making up front, and you've all seen the McLeamy curve, and thinking about if I'm making decision earlier, then that's going to solve some problems in the back end. What it doesn't solve, but it puts pressure on, is this idea of billing in increments at phases and milestones, right? So if I plan traditional kind of milestones for schematic, design development, construction construction documents, and so on, and then I'm pushing more of that up front, you'll see a kind of a bulge early in the project where I'm spending more hours than I can actually get value for, right? Now, part of that's an industry problem. That's something that we've been talking about for a while, that we've got to change how we scope projects. But it's also, a harder sell, I think, for the owners, unless there is value for them, right? And so if you're building more, maybe you're at a more collaborative project, an integrated project delivery style of delivery, and that begins to think about, the fact that we're in a shared environment and we're providing information early and we're coordinating early, that's more tangible than hey, I'm going to go off on my own and do a bunch of work up front that I want you to pay me more for than we used to, right? That's a harder sell, right? So in this case, the challenge is pretty easily connected. The fact is, we want to be more productive in those billable hours and milestones. But I think part of it goes back to scoping projects. And I think that's, to me, the challenge, where you've got, and I think that's changing as, slowly over time, as we get people moving up in experience that know the process and know how to scope it. It used to be 10 years ago when a project manager who didn't use the technology was using traditional methods for scoping the work needed on a project, then, you'd have these discrepancies, these gaps where, people would take less or more time than what was planned. And because they had, less control and could provide less constructive feedback on whether people were being productive or not, projects were suffering, right? One example I remember from years ago, I had a customer who was a project manager was explaining that, they were having some scoping issues, and they were talking about, well, it should take, I've scoped out a door schedule in BIM. It should take a week, right, to get that thing out, and then we'll move on to the next thing. And okay, well, how long is it taking? Oh, it's taking a week. Okay. Well, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the project manager would say, hey, you've got a week to do this door schedule. And the user, like, okay, well, I'll get it done. And they would get it done like in, the first half day, and maybe update it later. Maybe they were doing some other things, but the expectation was it was going to take a certain amount of time based on the old manual process. Well, now that it was automated, or it was, built in, they didn't have as much work. But the thing is, that then kind of changed. Well, what's the, how do they use that time to do something else more productive? right? So there was a misalignment with what was planned, the actual versus, the plan versus what was actually being done. So I think, to me, this is a big opportunity for us to, through standards, and I say standard workflows. And when I say standard workflows, being able to document how long does it take to do certain processes and what we should be doing with those processes, and what's to be expected of the user. Typically we show, hey, here's what the end result should look like. Okay, great. But if you're leaving it up to that user to decide the path to go and, when to get there, just in general, hey, we got to get this project done in 2 months. Okay. Well, they may be productive for those 2 months and then at the end say, oh, we need more time to do this thing. Or, but if I've built these kind of smaller packages of, hey, we have to do this process and it should take this long, and here's the process to do it, I got a little more control over it, right? But it takes time to set that up. There goes our overhead again. It takes training and education for people to understand that and communicate. So that's overhead. So that's some things that sometimes we're not willing to take on, right? Like, we'll train people in software, but we don't necessarily train them in the workflow that we've set up that's going to make them successful, right? So that's another challenge with this. So there are lots of things that we can set in terms of metrics leading up to good performance on getting work done as planned. And that is actually setting some expectations and then setting incremental milestones toward those things, right? So instead of thinking about, I got to get to 100% DD by, 3 months from now. Okay, what are the incremental steps to get there? Okay, well, we have to produce, the exterior package, or we've got to do all the layouts for, the area calculations and all those kinds of things. All right, so those start to be smaller, more manageable tasks that have some times, right? And so that's where we can start to connect in things like, on our weekly updates, project coordination, maybe we're talking about these packages and percent complete. Thing is, how can we measure that and be able to affect the KPIs based on that? And I think that's where you can go back and start thinking about, okay, well, how do I measure completeness in something? Well, if it's a parameter attached that I can pull off into a spreadsheet, I mean, it's kind of a manual way of doing it. But it also might be part of our QA/QC effort where someone says, yeah, you're at 50% complete. And then that ties back to a dashboard to say, we plan to be at, 75%, we're at 65%. What's the gap, right? And be able to kind of get down into the actual details of why we're off 10%, right? Thing is, having that kind of understanding and that level of management takes time, right? And so that then, if it's not scoped in and I'm not getting that as a benefit on the back end for the project, then you might even not attempt it, right? And I think that's, to me, the big challenge for this stuff. So how do we pull some simple metrics for that besides, well, one thing I think about is timesheets, right? So normally we put in a timesheet entry based on a particular project. We might get down to individual tasks in a project. I think a lot of the software now has the capability of breaking it down further. I mean, the challenge for that obviously is, hey, I've got, if I've got a potentially 20 different entries instead of 3 this week, that might be a hindrance, right? But, by having maybe one more layer could get you enough data then to say, hey, we're off this amount, right? And I think, to me, that's the challenge. One thing I was thinking about too with this was the idea that if, you're just an example, if you're scoping a project at the, the milestone level, and then you're not factoring in certain things that might be influenced by overhead. And I think that's true for a lot of things with BIM and VDC in general, and that fact that there are things outside the scope. Just like when we went from hand drafting to CAD, we improved the efficiency of some things, but we also added more language and more structure that needed to be accommodated, right? Being able to plot something, that takes time, right? And so, making those processes efficient, setting some safeguards about, if we're outside the scope, that sends up a red flag and saying, hey, we've got an issue with how this is being managed. All those things, I think, to me, are probably available. They just may not be tied together in a matrix of understanding of how they're related, right? And that's where something like a Power BI or the things pulling in time cards, pulling in, journal files from software, even some more manual processes of like, hey, here's a checkbox from the weekly thing that we did that's a lead indicator that influences this. All those things are related. All right. And thanks for letting me go down the rabbit hole on that. So now that we have the metric we want to track and thinking about it as a lead versus a lag indicator, and maybe it's easily attainable. Maybe it's something that we're pulling from a software that we know pretty well. And we recognize it as being important, and that we also can have some reasonable expectation that it falls in a predictable range, so it's consistent in its output. And I think that's important, because as soon as you get something that's outside that range, then you have to be suspicious that you're actually getting the right data, right? And there's the I think what they call it, the Pareto range. Look that up. That's Six Sigma talk. So now that you've got that information and you've also interpreted these things, how does it influence the KPI? And it could be indirect or direct. Is it easily changeable, right? Is this something that's so embedded in our process it's going to take years to unravel? Well, that maybe not the one I tackle first. Maybe it's the one that I feel like I can change. Maybe it has the most impact for the least amount of change, right? Like I'll tell you, for me, not every organization tracks time how they should. Right? I had an organization years ago say, oh, well, things take a long time in BIM. Okay, well, how long do they take? Well, more time than we scope. Okay, well, how do you scope things? Well, we do it based on previous projects and the fact that we're tracking 40 hours. I'm like, oh, but I see a lot of people working overtime. Well, we don't track overtime. Okay, that's the first thing you need to change, right? What's the actual time it takes you to do these things, and be able to track that and understand over time that you have history and that maybe you can influence that. But if you don't know, you're not tracking all the time being spent, then, you've already handicapped yourself, right? Anyway, so, what is the level of impact? I think that's an important thing too, right? That's how you begin to prioritize things, right? If I can make a simple change, like in this case, tracking every single hour that I spend, and now it gets into politics about, how designers get paid overtime and things like that. I know that's a challenge. But if I'm able to affect change very, greatly without necessarily making a big change in the process that we do. In this case, they were already tracking time. They just weren't tracking all their time. That made a big impact. So now that you've got all these things, what can you do now, right? So we're going to, and I would say build a plan. The thing is, you have to be intentional about your actions, right? I'm going to adjust the workflow. I'm going to train staff in a new skill, whatever it is that is going to improve this performance, right? And thing is, that's a countermeasure to something you've already done before, right? So you're working now, you're producing things now. You're not having to rebuild necessarily. You're just adjusting, right? You're fine tuning, optimizing. I like to use that term, optimizing. So in this case, you plan an action and you communicate that, you get buy-in for it. And then you put it in place temporarily, right? So you think, okay, we're going to make a change, and we're going to do this change over a month or two, and we're going to review incrementally along the way how it's affecting the performance. And at the end of it, we hope to see this. If we see something less significant, maybe we abandon it. If we see something more significant, maybe there's more opportunities there, right? And so that's the way I think about it. All right. So once you determine those changes, then you can say, I'm going to invest in that some more, or I'm going to divest from that and move on to something different. But whatever the case, you got to communicate that. And when I say up and down, you got to communicate it to leadership. You got to communicate it to the user, because both are going to make decisions based on that, right? And that's why I think, to me, communication for all this stuff is very important. And it's something that's difficult for all organizations. You get so kind of caught up in your own team and what we're doing that you may not be sharing the positives or even the negatives with outside teams, right? And it ends up being kind of, frankly, anecdotal, and it's hard to act on anecdotes, right? We need to have some hard metrics. And I think this goes back to the fact that if I try to get buy-in based on some real numbers, we're probably going to succeed. Okay? So I have some closing thoughts, right? You need to recognize that business level and operational performance are directly linked, right? And as I said, implicitly or explicitly. Metrics from your tools in analysis needs to be funneled into impactful action. So the whole reason you're measuring things is to do something different, right? Either invest more in what you're doing or invest in different things, or divest of things that you're doing wrong, right? And I also think, too, you need to be able to communicate all this stuff to your organization and frame it into what motivates people, right? Financially for your leadership, often, but also in terms of what expectations are for your users. But the thing is, the users, to me, are probably the most important group, because that's the foundation for all of your organizations. You need to be thinking about ways that, hey, how can I support my teams better based on this knowledge we've learned from aligning these metrics, right? So if we need to be more productive, and I need to, I don't need to be putting pressure on people to, they're not working hard enough. And that's not the right answer. The right answer is, I need to give you more power, more enablement to get where we think we can go based on the patterns that we're seeing. That's really what it comes down to. All right. So it's kind of a call to action I want to give you. And I think there's some things internal. There's also things that we can help you with. So, being able to ask leadership for KPIs, if you're not tracking that currently at your level, working with them to align with that, just pick one. Pick one to build a process around, set a baseline, learn some things from your measurements, be able to set a change specifically that changes that metric, understand the change and be able to communicate that. And I think those are things that you can do. We have a lot of experience with that. So I've been working with BIM as a process for more than 20 years. I've got a very talented team that I work with that are technical, that are strategic, and everywhere in between. We can help you develop some KPIs. We have a computational design group that can build automation and pull patterns out of the current work without disrupting it, but that can also give you some actionable metrics, right? We also have a service called BIM Management as a Service where we can come in and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, replace your BIM manager with us. We can help support them and supplement their work. And, we have experience building a lot of standards and content and building workflows around these different processes that you're doing. Our team is architects and engineers, so they've done this kind of work before. So lots of great stuff. Let me actually give you a little bit more information about those. I think, to me, that the BIM Management as a Service is something we've been doing with a lot of customers. It's a very well-received process. But I think what it does is it ends up, one, if you don't have a BIM manager, maybe you're a small firm, this is a great service for us to come in on an incremental basis and help support some very specific things. We can do training around a particular workflow. We can build additional standardization and documentation around that standardization and be able to monitor performance. But we can also help optimize. Maybe you've been doing BIM and VDC for a while. We can help you optimize that process and get more out of it. You get more of the benefits. All right. And so certainly we'd love to talk to you about that as a process. We're real excited about computational design. Now, computational design has a lot of different aspects. I mean, one, you think about, I can do generative design and very, exciting conceptual design workflow, but practically using things like Dynamo for Revit and other technologies, we can build automation, we can build information gathering. Now, I think that goes back to what we were talking about in this webinar. We can build processes to pull information out of your design workflow that can help you better understand what needs to change. To me, that's a real exciting aspect to this, being able to understand very quickly, are we winning, or are we losing today, right? And so, to me, very important aspect. All right. I left a little bit of time for some questions. I don't know if anybody wants to ask, how they might go at some of these metrics, if they've got some metrics that need interpreting, if they want some ideas about, how to act on some of these metrics. I'm here for you.
I do have a question here, Lance. How do people get in touch with you after the webinar for any additional insights or questions or any of the trainings?
Yeah, you can just reach me. My email is lkirby, Kirby, at ASTI.com. I'd love to talk to you about this kind of stuff. Said I work with customers and I've worked from a single person firms all the way up to 93,000 person firms. So I've covered the whole gambit, and love to talk to you about, I'm really excited about workflows. And to me, that's where there's a lot of untapped potential in a lot of firms. You're doing great stuff. I think we can do better.
I love it. Fantastic. Thank you, Lance, for walking us through that. I feel like I can speak for the group when I say actually walking away with some great insight on performance measurements here today. So I don't see any other comments or questions here, but thank you all for joining us. We do appreciate you spending time, and we trust that it's meaningful and impactful for you and your businesses. And we do look forward to seeing you on future webinars. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Thank you.